First and foremost, thank you everybody for taking the time to join in out of your busy schedule to listen to me speak today. Today's supposed to be very informal. It's supposed to be sort of a question and answer session. What we're going to be covering today is going to be the processing of invoicing as well as accounts receivable management. I know this is troubling for a lot of sites, and it was for myself when I first joined the clinical research industry. And some of the things I want to focus on today are not only invoicing, but your site's future financial health and predictors as far as taking a look at what you think you need to be looking into when doing your budgets and when you decide to want to do clinical research studies at your sites. And we also want to do pretty much a good overview of studies in general and how you are managing your studies at your site. So for starters, I want to give you a little history about who I am and where I came from. I am a former clinical research coordinator. I used to work at a private site in Atlanta, Georgia. We mainly focus on hepatology studies, but my primary focus when I first joined clinical research was to be a coordinator, to do the day-to-day, draw labs, do EDC entries, and I slowly progressed into the contracts and financial management of clinical trials. Having been able to work at the research site, I think I gained a tremendous amount of experience, and I also learned what it was like to struggle as a coordinator. So for those of you on the call who are coordinators, please know I've been in your shoes before, and I know where the challenges come from. And for those of you that are either site owners or site finance management folks, please take into account the experiences that your CRCs are currently having and the time and effort they go into doing these visits with the patients and get a better understanding of what the true value is of not only their work, but the cost of conducting clinical trials. Because that's probably one of the most important things as far as making clinical trials financially feasible for your sites. So I think one of the first things I want to start with is going to be about future financial health. So with future financial health, you want to focus on, is it the cash flow that's an issue for your site? Is it your study pipeline, or is it your profit margin for your site? So I think the first thing you really want to look at is your current pipeline, okay? How many studies do you currently have enrolling at your site? What do you have upcoming for either the next month or the next quarter? Are you looking at this on an annual basis? Have you started thinking about your revenue streaming? Are you doing revenue on a cash or accrual basis? So now for our site that I used to work at, we used to do this on a cash basis, so we really didn't know what our forthcoming revenues were. And now here at BTC Network, we track all of our sites on an accrual basis. And the reason for that is we want to understand what has our site earned during that period that we were capturing. So let's say we're in March, so back in February, at what point during the month of February did our site earn money? What studies? What revenue items? And how can we intertwine that into our future goals for the upcoming year? So now, the reason this is behind is because we also want to understand expenses too. So expenses incurred in that month. You want to be able to know how much your site is truly making. For all of our sites, the end goal is to really ensure that a profit margin of about 20% is being made at your site in order to be financially feasible to conduct research. So when we talk about cash flow, we want to talk about the common goals in your contract. So you want monthly payments for your site. So if you're seeing patients on a monthly basis, and at the end of the month you know you've completed, you want to make sure that you're getting paid retroactively at the end of each month. So for every 4 weeks you do work, you should be expecting a payment within 4 weeks of the end of that month. And then for those sites that have payments that are on a quarterly basis, it's something you sort of reevaluate and say, well, what other studies do we have that we can add to our pipeline that will alleviate the distance between the time we started earning money to the time we actually get paid. You also want to look at your pass-through revenue items. That's also a big kicker. And then also look at your institutional expenses. Are you using third-party vendors when you're talking about your clinical trials? You've got your dry ice shipments that you get in from an outside party, or you have one of your sites that go pick it up from the store. You've got your imaging centers that you're using. What are your costs associated with those? Your advertising and recruitment. For a lot of sites, I know we didn't have the issue of recruiting patients because we actually had our own database, but for sites that don't, how much are you spending with your vendors to really recruit the best patient population that you need for your studies. And then you've got the route of the investigational products that you're using. Are you using an infusion? Are you using an injection? Will you need a staff member to help administer the drugs or to mix the drugs in order to administer them to patients? Then you got your staffing expenses. You got your research coordinator, your research nurse. You got your physicians. Is your physician board certified? It's a big question a lot of sponsors and CROs are asking. Because in some cases, in order to conduct a trial, your PI needs to be board certified in that specific type of indication. Then you've got your contract employees and your physician assistants. For your contract employees, you're thinking, well, am I having somebody come in and do data entry for us? Are we having somebody process the labs? Do we need a pharmacist for that matter? And then lastly, you want to look at your medical supplies. And for medical supplies, you've got your ECG machines, ones that aren't being supplied by the sponsors. You've also got your either -20 or -70 degree freezer, something that a lot of sites may not necessarily have, but they need for a study. How are you taking those expenses into account when putting in your budget for cash flow? And lastly, you've also got your biohazard waste, and you've got your ancillary supplies that you need in order to conduct trials and to do lab work and to keep your exam rooms looking presentable with the bed sheets and the bed covers for the pillows. So now, I think we should move on to invoicing and the current processes versus the old processes that used to go on in clinical research. In the meantime, while I continue to do that, please feel free to ask me a question in the box, and perhaps if there's something that I touched on that maybe I didn't elaborate on enough, please feel free to let me know, and I'll try and address that in the interim. So for the invoicing process, the way things used to be in research is that you used to have to create your own invoices. And in doing so, you would have to either do it in an Excel spreadsheet or in a Word doc, and you would submit it via email, or you'd have to actually fax it in, is what we used to have to do. And from there, you would hope that somebody at the CRO or sponsor level would have it processed and then reimbursed. And we used to get those reimbursed via check, because we never did wire transfers at our site. And currently, we now have new systems where sponsors and CROs are asking sites to submit invoices electronically. Electronic is either via email, or you've got these new portals now. So a lot of large sponsors and CROs are asking sites to upload their invoices to portals. And for those of you who've had the pleasure of using a portal to submit your invoices, I'm sure you know how easy that process is. And maybe I'm being a little too sarcastic because it's really not that easy. The joy of using a portal is good because it tracks how you upload the material, and you can track it on there and for the approval and payment process. But the challenges involved in submitting invoices electronically through a portal is that if something isn't entered 100% correctly, 9 times out of 10, you're going to get a rejection notice from that CRO or sponsor. And it has to go through their chain of command in order to approve it or deny it. And once you've gone through that process, then when you have to resubmit an invoice, that becomes a lot more challenging, because then you have to either update your invoice that you created, then you've got to resubmit it into the portal, but then you've got to update your assigned invoice number. So if you had already created an invoice number for that particular invoice, but you wanted to update it that same day, you then got to tweak your submission based on that requirement that the sponsors or CROs are looking for. The great thing about these new portals is that they become very easy, but the second challenging part, I think, to it is that who do you reach out to? Is there somebody that can help answer your question about when am I going to be reimbursed? There's nobody you can talk to, like when you go onto the web and you say you want to purchase an order for a product, and you have a customer, supplier support line where you can chat with somebody. On these portals, that's something they're missing, and I think that we should speak up to some of these CROs and sponsors and let them know the challenges that we're having, that submitting an invoice in these portals is not very easy, but if we have somebody we could reach out to help us in the event that we don't understand the process, that's something we could use moving forward. Now I want to kind of move on to the future financial health of your site. So something that we focus on with some of our own sites is that we want to be able to predict how we're going to do, and in order to do that, we want to touch on the hidden costs. So, as a lot of you may know, there are a lot of hidden costs in conducting research that aren't taken into account when you put together your budget. And a lot of those revenue items and or expenses are things that take place outside of the normal scope of a visit. So I think some of the ones that we hit on the most that we see a lot of sites don't get reimbursed for are regulatory and site submissions. As you all know, that regulatory submissions from the startup perspective can be challenging because you want to get them turned around as quickly as possible. And during that time frame, you're also working on your contract and budget negotiations. So for sponsors, they want those regulatory docs within roughly 2 business days, let's say. So as you're doing those, you want to make sure everything's filled out correctly, because you've also got your 1572, you've got your financial disclosure forms for your PIs and sub-Is and any other staff members. And you also want to make sure that all of your documents are submitted with the appropriate information for all those members that are actually going to be participating on the site. So when they get them, they know exactly what they're looking for. And then when you do your IRB submission, you want to make sure that your patient reimbursement is included on those forms. And sometimes you're going to have missing pieces when completing your documents and submissions, and so that takes a lot of time out of your staff in order to do that to make sure things are correct. So a lot of times we've had instances where we submitted regulatory documents and they had to be updated because our address wasn't reflected correctly as it was on the 1572, for instance. So you want to make sure everything matches accordingly, because then you don't want to have to go back and do resubmissions. That can be a little bit challenging for some members of your site. You've got, next is probably sponsor-specific GCP training. Now it's becoming more common across the board to see this happen more frequently. I noticed that the first thing I ever did as a research coordinator, before I started seeing patients, before I started looking at data entry, and before I even started putting lab kits together, was I had to do GCP training. That's probably one of the most imperative things any member that decides to join clinical research industry should do, is focus on understanding what it means and understands to be a good clinical research participant. Because good clinical practices is probably the biggest indicator as far as how you're going to do, not only as a research coordinator, but as anybody staffing that you're going to hire as far as being a participant on a research study. Next, you've got EDC training. We've all seen EDC systems, and they're constantly evolving. The challenge is staying up to date on them. So for a lot of sponsors, they're allowing sites to keep the same certification, but they may want it updated based on the new version that the CRO is currently using with that specific vendor. Take that into account. Now remember, in order to take these things into account, we're looking at time and effort too. In order to price these items up, take a look at the time and effort involved. Each one of these items that I'm discussing today, it involves time and effort from your site, from your staff. These are things outside of the normal scope of a visit that needs to be done based on data that's being required by the sponsors and CROs to capture. So now if we look at SAEs from the time they initially are caught by your site, you have to report them to the sponsor and CROs. You then got to report them to the IRB, and then you've got to start beginning the submission of the actual document itself, documenting what happened with that SAE. And then you've got to continue to follow that patient and continue to gather those reports. There's a lot of labor involved in doing some of this stuff. And you've got reconsenting, protocol amendments to the usuals, and you've got unscheduled visits for unforeseen reasons, whether it's the device wasn't working that you're currently on for a particular trial, or they had an AE, or because of the AE they needed some new medication, so they need to be evaluated. Two of the big ones that I think I noticed as a coordinator that are starting to be talked about more frequently are monitoring visits and CRA changes at the site level. So when you're conducting research, you've got to have the CRAs come and check your data. So they've got to verify that the data you record on your source documents matches what's currently in EDC. And the challenges that I always saw was that the CRAs would come monthly, and then if you were a high enrolling site and you had a sponsor that had to meet their database lock, the CRA would have to come out to the site more frequently. And in order to do that, they may have to send more people, or if they had a more important study going on, they had to reallocate a CRA. And during those times, we would get new CRAs that would come into our site, and we would lose the one we've been working with for the first 2 quarters of the study. In order to do that, we had to sort of train that CRA to get them up to speed as far as where our site currently was on the study. We've also had experience where the CRA wasn't familiar with that type of indication. So we had to better educate them about why the PI thought the patient was eligible for this trial given their medical history, as that CRA thought that maybe the medical history didn't line up with the IND criteria. So these are things that are important for your site to take into account the cost of actually conducting research. And then lastly, you've also got your pharmacy maintenance, your lab kit maintenance, and understanding that you also need to maintain good financial records. At the end of a study, we spend more time, at least in our finance department, going through and reconciling all the payments from startup to closeout, making sure that our books tie out 100%. Because for a lot of studies now, we're looking at holdback amounts. And if you get a payment from a sponsor or CRO and they say, here's your final payment of 5% that we've deducted over the course of all of your payments during the course of the study, you want to be sure at the end of the day to say that, yes, that report you gave me matches that 5% that we should have been owed. And how would you go about tracking that? So we used to use a budget template that I would have created at the site level through Excel. And in doing that, I was able to calculate based on the payments I was getting that we should have landed on X number of dollars. Now, we currently here in our finance team work with a CTMS platform, which I think is more not only user-friendly, but it's more reliable, and it does all the calculations for you. So when sponsors and CROs say, all right, well, thank you for enrolling all of your patients on the study, and we appreciate all your hard work, but you now have 30 days to reconcile your books. So you've had 35 patients enroll in a study that's lasted 3.5 years. Are you going to tell me you're going to be able to go through an Excel spreadsheet and make sure all the numbers match up? For me, that was never an easy case. So utilizing a CTMS platform has been very helpful and very beneficial as far as making sure that our financial records are 100% at the end of the study. So I think I want to get into sort of something that a lot of sites talk about, and we've seen questions about this more frequently during the course of some of the webinars that our company does. Is there a regional guide that companies are utilizing in order to determine budgets before they send them to sites? That's just a great question, because a lot of sponsors and CROs are coming to sites with a budget and say, all right, here's what we have to offer you. Are you willing to take it? And a site may look at the budget and say, you know what, that's really low. I wonder how they're coming up with those numbers. And for us, we do the same thing, but in order for us to sort of figure that out, we price up our budgets. And how do we do that? We take an Excel spreadsheet and we build a template of the budget based on the time and event schedule. And we look at the price of each procedure across the board and when it should occur at each visit. And then we also take into account time and effort. So time and effort is a big value driver as far as understanding where you are revenue-wise for each subject visit over the course of a study. So once you're able to sort of calculate all that together, compare it to what these sponsors are giving you, because they're giving you a value of what they think is a fair market value. And I use that term loosely, because they're using that based on an aggregate calculation of what a study indication has been offered over the course of time and a general median value for each visit across the course of a study. They're also taking into account time and effort as well, but on a lower scale. Coming from the site level, I know the time and effort that it took me as a coordinator to go in and do the consenting with the PI and the patients. And if they had a caregiver there, that also took extra time because they had to help explain it, and they would have to sign on behalf of the patient. And they had a lot more questions because they're taking care of the patient day in and day out. So they want to know what to expect of whatever investigational product they were working with. And outside of the recent sensing, you've also got the things that are involved as far as shipping and preparation, having your lab kit inventory looked at to make sure that none of the kits are expiring, to make sure you're sort of up to speed on your patient enrollment and patient activity throughout the course of the study. You want to take into account also that you want to make sure patients are compensated for their time. So you want to look at the patient reimbursement rates that they're currently offering versus what you think your patients should be getting based on the expectations the sponsor has for your participating patients. And then you also want to take into account the cost of the fees for your PI and for your study coordinator and for your data entry personnel and for your outside physicians or vendors. And really look close at, is this really matching up to what this is going to cost us in order to conduct the trial? Make it financially feasible for your site. And be mindful that sometimes you may have to decline a study because it just doesn't meet your criteria for a financially feasible study. So now I just want to check in and see if there are any questions about what we've talked about so far, or what I've talked about so far. And if not, I want to at least touch on one other area, which I think we specialize in pretty well, which is sort of, I think I've hinted on it already, sort of how we build our budgets, but the most important thing about what you need to do, or what we focus on the most when developing our budgets. And some of those key points, I think, are reading through the protocol. For me, reading through the protocol is like reading through a novel for some people. I read it from front to back, and in some cases, I may read it 2 or 3 times. I want to understand how much work is involved for this particular trial that I want to have our site participate on. Then I'll look at the time and event schedule. And then the time and event schedule, it gives me a sense of how frequently and at what visits are these procedures to be conducted. And then I can look at, well, based on all that information, how much data is the sponsor or CRO looking to capture within EDC? And when I look at that, I also look at the breakout of how the procedures are to be completed in the order they're required by the sponsor. I'm also reaching out more so now than I was before to sponsors and CROs to figure out, what are those ECRF pages looking like? How much time is it going to take me to input the data based on what's actually happened at the visit? And then I also want to calculate my time and effort. So this all sort of ties in. Remember, time and effort equals money. This is the value of your budget based on how you feel the study should be conducted and what the sponsor should be paying you. Remember to read the fine print of the time and event schedule. This is probably the biggest kicker that a lot of people overlook. The footnotes will tell you sort of how certain procedures should be completed. So when it comes to PK samples especially, that's probably one of the most important, or ECGs. So for ECGs, we're currently seeing that at screening, they may only be singular, but at baseline, sponsors wanted in triplicate. Are you taking that into account? What if a patient has an abnormal ECG and needs to have multiple ECGs completed? Are you taking into account that the setup time for an ECG? Remembering that patient has to be supine for at least 5 to 10 minutes. Making sure that the placements are correct. Are you utilizing the sponsor's third-party vendor machine that they need you to then transmit afterwards? So really take these things into account. And when looking into PK sampling, also remember that while sponsors may say a PK sample is required at a certain visit, they could also say in the footnotes that we need it collected over X number of time points. So if you're on a serial PK sub-study, make sure not only are you aware, but your patients are aware of the time that's going to take to conduct those PK samples. Again, I'll revert back to time and effort time and time again because it's probably one of the most important things with developing your budget. So you've got your cost per procedure, that what your site thinks is feasible to be reimbursed for. And then you've got your time and effort. So that goes into not only staffing fees, but how involved is your site and your staff into gathering all this information, interacting with the patients, and inputting the data within EDC. Then once you've built your template, look at the overall cost of what they provided to you. Look at your site's overhead. What we're seeing with a lot of our sites now is that they're averaging between a 30 to 35% rate for overhead. Make sure this covers your ancillary costs, because for a lot of times when you negotiate a budget, the sponsor's not going to be willing to reimburse you for dry ice or for gauze and alcohol swabs or syringes or pipettes. They're going to consider this the cost of doing business. So remember to include your site's overhead at a reasonable rate to account for costs that may not be associated within the budget. And remember that some of these overhead costs are also calculated into the cost of your electrical bills, your water bills, your waste bills, and some additional staff fees that may not be listed within your budget. And lastly, also, I would say focus on your patient stipend amounts, your pass-through fees. Again, like I talked about before, your pass-through fees and your sort of outside the normal scope of revenue items that sponsors and CROs really aren't looking at, the time and effort that goes into these things, add them to your budget. Make sure you're asking for what you think is the most reasonable amount to be compensated for the work that you're being completed. So that's, I think, all I've got for today. I know we're sort of running out of time here. So for all of you that took the time to sit in on this, I hope this was helpful and beneficial to all of you. If you have certain questions about what I've talked about, or if you want me to elaborate more on what I've discussed, please feel free to drop us a question or drop the moderator an email and let me know, and I'll be happy to address you individually. Thanks again for your time, and I hope we get to do this again in the future.